Well, the truth is that the Cold War with the Russians is over, and the threats we face are from lots of small terrorist groups around the world. And really, the Trident weapon system isn't appropriate for dealing with them. And we've seen bombs in London and in New York and in Paris, and all those countries are nuclear weapon states. So it's not the right system for the threats we face. And the second thing I'd say is that a fair estimate of the cost is that it's about £40 billion. And that's a lot of money, and we could do much more creative things with that money.
Well, I come at question nuclear weapons from within principles of just war. Just war theory has been developed by a whole load of theologians down the past ages, and it's about thinking about a way how can we think through when it's fair to fight, when it's right to fight, when it's just to fight. And Christian theologians have developed a series of ways of thinking about that, and those have been in terms of you need to have a good cause for going to war, you need to fight the war properly and justly, and you need to think about what happens after the war as well. And so amongst the things they've developed is the idea of the principles of so-called discrimination and proportion. Discrimination means that you must never target civilians, and proportion means that you must use, if you're going to fight, you must always have the minimal side effects possible. Now, what does it mean when it comes to nuclear weapons? Well, the question about nuclear weapons is this: can you ever bomb a city with a nuclear weapon in a way that doesn't cause massive civilian casualties? And the answer to my mind is no. And if the answer to that is no, then you can never use nuclear weapons. If you can't use nuclear weapons, the question then is it ever justified in possessing them? And I would say, if it's wrong to use them, it is wrong to threaten to use them. And if it's wrong to threaten to use them, then we can never actually use them. So that'd be my answer to your mother.
Well, nuclear weapons aren't a good idea. If we didn't have them, we wouldn't invent them today. I think the important thing, though, is how we actually work to actually get to that nuclear-free world. The way to do that, I don't think, is by the UK unilaterally giving up its own nuclear deterrent. What we need to do is renew the successor submarines that are being procured hopefully later this year, and work actively like the last Labour government did to get those international talks going of how we can reduce the nuclear stockpiles in the world.
I would say to someone who was asking why I don't believe that we should have Trident and the Trident replacement is that I don't think Britain's any safer because of the Trident replacement system. I think it's a costly mistake. I think it's militarily inept. It's for the Cold War. It's not for modern warfare. I think it's economically madness, but I think morally the idea that we could wipe out nations and cities using warheads that are 10 times more powerful than the ones we dropped on Hiroshima is against what God would want for this earth. So I don't think Sweden's any less safe for not having it, but it is a bit richer because it doesn't have their nuclear weapons. And I think we should follow the suit of places like that.
Well, even if there was, and let's remember it's always only a theory that that's what's kept the peace in the last 50 years. Now, it is true that there has been peace between the superpowers in the last 50 years, and it is true that the superpowers have had nuclear weapons. What no one has demonstrated is that there is a connection between the two causally. And I think it is always the case that actually to use nuclear weapons would itself be genuinely mad. Mutually assured destruction is madness. And if we even begin to think in those terms, we've actually lost the plot, morally speaking.
I think it has worked in terms of two major superpowers in the world, the former Soviet Union and the USA, not going to using those nuclear weapons against each other. And I think it has prevented that type of... what we're into now, though, I think, is a dangerous situation where we have Russia rearming in terms of their nuclear weapons, but also we have a possibility of non-state actors being involved in nuclear weapons. And that's why we do need to work very hard to ensure that we get those nuclear talks going. The last Labour government started that, certainly in terms of the work that's been going on in terms of the agreement in Iran to stop them developing new nuclear weapons, and that is what we're going to be committed to. At the same time, we need to ensure that we have our deterrent to ensure that those deterrent has worked for the last 60 years continues.
Well, I do think that it did work up to 1989 when the Berlin Wall fell. Yes, I don't have any doubt about that. But I think that we're living in a new world now, and sources of power and sources of threat have changed. And I don't think there's anybody in the entire world who's got their guns trained on us. And that's why it doesn't seem to me to be appropriate at this time.
Mutually assured destruction is it hasn't caused world peace, because you can count numerous amounts of wars, particularly proxy wars in Africa, in Latin America, and throughout Asia, where the superpowers have fought their wars and people have died in their millions. So I don't think it's world peace. I mean, whether you can say that the threat of killing someone and killing whole populations is a really good way to protect world peace is well, it's mad in itself. But I don't think it's contributed to world peace, because there hasn't been world peace in its time.
Well, that's a hard one to answer, because obviously, you know, if the Americans have got nuclear weapons, that's likely to protect us from some threats. On the other hand, I'm not sure that I would say that Britain was much safer than Germany, which doesn't. So I don't think there's a straightforward yes or no to that one.
If we didn't have nuclear weapons today, would we acquire them as a country? No, we don't. We've got to start from the fact that we have nuclear weapons. Decisions were taken after the Second World War to develop an independent nuclear deterrent. I think we should keep them, but also make sure we work hard to try and get those multilateral talks to reduce the world stockpiles. I think if we do that, and the last Labour government worked very hard to not only reduce our own stockpiles down to the million that we needed, but also to try and get international talks going to stop proliferation, but also to make sure that existing nuclear states reduce their stockpiles.
Well, obviously, when Nelson Mandela and de Klerk decided that they weren't going to carry on being a nuclear power and dismantle their nuclear weapons, that didn't suddenly mean that Mandela lost his credibility as a world leader. In fact, the opposite was true. It assured his place as a proper world leader. I think the hope that Obama would have done more in terms of cutting back nuclear weapons would have increased his ability to be someone who we looked up to in the world. And in fact, of course, he got a Nobel Peace Prize based on the idea that he was going to do more about nuclear weapons, which he hasn't, disappointingly. So, the South Africa model is one that we would like to see happen more and more around the world.
I think people may feel safer. Whether they actually are safer is a completely different matter. There are plenty of countries around the place which are similar size to ourselves, many in Europe, for example, Germany, Italy, and so on, which don't possess nuclear weapons, and it's not at all obvious to me that they feel much less secure than we do. And I think our security is based much more on lots of other things. There are plenty of other kinds of power than nuclear weapons.
Well, the problem we've got at the moment is we have got a rearming Russia that are, as we speak, not only increasing their nuclear arsenals, but developing new technologies for that. And that is an unwelcome reaction in terms of following the Cold War. We thought that we were actually moving towards disarmament. And I think in terms of trying to get Russia back to the negotiating table, certainly giving up our nuclear weapons unilaterally would not help that.
I think there's clearly a risk that the permanent undersea deterrent becomes a force that can be detected with new technology, in which case, of course, its special status will just collapse overnight. And I wouldn't rule that out in the long term.
We have made a world where power comes from having nuclear weapons. So the 5 permanent members of the the Security Council are the 5 nuclear states, and until those powers begin to let go of their nuclear authority and the power they get from having those nuclear weapons, then it's going to be more and more likely that other nations are going to try and have nuclear weapons. Ultimately, if we carry on this game, there's going to be more and more states with nuclear weapons in the future. I think they estimate that up to 30 states could have the technology to do so, unless we take some dramatic moves to make sure that we say that we don't want a nuclear future, and we don't want to have the possibility that there'll be more and more states that have the capacity to deliver nuclear weapons.
Clearly, there are a number of countries around the world which are very committed to possessing and maintaining and developing nuclear weapons, but usually they're very much involved in local regional wars. India and Pakistan, for example, is the most obvious example. And I think there's no reason to think that we, in any foreseeable future, that we ourselves are under greater threat at all. I think the kinds of threats that we're under, whether from climate change, whether from microbial infections, whatever it is, there are many bigger threats to our security than anything which could be defended by nuclear weapons.